Welcome to the ICA. My name is Antonia Blocker. I'm the Associate Curator of Talks here. I'd like to thank you all for braving the cold weather and coming to today's Culture Now. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mark Boulos, who will be joining conversation with Ossian Ward. Today's conversation coincides with Mark's solo exhibition at the Lisson Gallery, so hopefully you will get to go and have a chance to see it. So please turn off your mobile phones and join me in welcoming Ossian and Mark.
So just before we get started proper, I'm going to introduce Mark, and then we're going to see a little clip of one of his films, one of the films showing at Lisson. So briefly, Mark was born in Boston and is now based between Amsterdam and Geneva, but studied here at the National Film and Television School and at the Rijksacademy. And I first came into contact with his work almost a decade ago. We were talking about Beck's Futures here, which some of you may remember at the ICA, and then Bloomberg New Contemporaries. And I wrote about his work for East International in 2006. And difficult to describe exactly how he's an artist, filmmaker, making works in documentary style, but often that's not, it's not as simple as that. Sometimes they cross into fiction, but they are generally structured around interviews, handheld camera work, with research and journalistic intent. So the piece we're about to see is actually a multi-screen installation, and I should mention the themes often kind of recur in his work, which kind of range from political and religious fanaticism. So he's filmed jihadists in London and Brooklyn, and a Damascus housewife with visions of the Virgin and suffering from stigmata. But the work that we're going to look at today is called No Permanent Address of 2010, and the title shares an acronym with the subjects of the film, who are the New People's Army in the Philippines, who are a group of Marxist-Leninist guerrillas attempting to reappropriate and redistribute the land there. And without wanting to give too much away, it's a film about communism, about comradeship, and strangely also about love, with a strong undercurrent of violence. So I'll let you see the clip, and then we'll talk a bit more with Mark on this.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me. Thanks, Ossian. And the clip you're about to see is from the film. I don't want to say too much about it. It's preceded by an installation shot of the film. It's on 3 screens. The installation shot is not from the Lisson show, but from its premiere at the Vancouver Gallery, the Belkin Gallery at University of British Columbia. So you'll get to see how it looks as installed. The clip is a split-screen preview, so the difference will be obvious. And it's about 5 minutes, and then we'll talk about it.
Siyempre, gusto nating magtagumpay. Ito, salitang tagumpay. Ngayon, tsoryang gabay ng ating partido ay ang Marxismo, Leninismo, Maoismo. Ano ba gayon? Naku, parang ito yata ay mabigat pakinggan, pero alam niyo ba, ang ginawa ninyong kumpiskasyon, yun na ay nagpapaliwanag ng mga tsoryang ito. Galing din yun kina Marx, kina Lenin, kina Mao, Leninism. Mismo, yan ang MLM. Isa-isahin natin yan. Ngayon, kung wala itong Marxismo, Leninismo, Maoismo, wala din partido. Kasi ito'y teorya, mga kasama. Teorya na ating gabay. Kaya baga, kailangan lagi tayong mag-aaral. Ngayon, nagpapalalim pa tayo dun sa tsoryang yun, na naging gabay natin para makabuo ng mga patakaran sa ating revolusyong agraryo, sa ating lupa na ipagtagumpay. Ang MMM ay isang universal na katotohanan. Naku, yan na naman. Ano na yung universal na yan? Pag universal na kasama ito, masaklaw ito. Ito palang MLM ay totoo noong unang panahon, ngayon, at sa susunod pang malayong panahon, hindi na natin matanaw, hindi na natin makikita. At hindi lamang sa Pilipinas yan totoo, kundi sa buong daigdig at lampas pa sa daigdig. Ito ay totoo. Sa Igbo. Nakuha ba natin yun, mga kasama?
We have studied the Christian history, the church history, and the teachings of Jesus is not contradicting to the communism. The early church people, early believers in Acts, and written in the Acts of Apostles, chapter 2 and chapter 4, there is evidence that they live like a commune, like commune in Paris commune. Like when you preach the real message of Jesus, you're preaching communism. When you're saying that love one another, serve one another. When Jesus said you sell your properties and give it to the poor, you are teaching communism.
Cheers. So I should point out, since making the film, as Mark makes clear in the Lisson, in the downstairs room at the Lisson show, where you can see the work properly on 3 screens, many of those guerrillas have since been killed, haven't they? So can you just say a bit about when you went out there, how you spent kind of 8 weeks out there filming, and what you found when you got there, really?
Well, what I found, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, talk about what your experiences were, briefly, about sort of being in the jungle.
It was quite an odyssey to get there, as it were. I mean, lots of trusting of people I had only just met, and people who had public personalities but were underground Communist Party members, who were not militant but living in the city, and then who kind of shepherded me into the guerrilla zone. And none of that could be filmed, or I can't talk too much about how I got there, because the Communist Party is illegal in the Philippines, and the New People's Army is actually illegal here in the U.S. because it's considered a terrorist group by the EU and USA, although the Communist Party is not. The NPA is the militant wing of the Communist Party. So it was transitioning to the guerrilla zone is basically you crossing the line of legality, the kind of militarized border, and that was a real odyssey, kind of having to hide in in fishing boats and being ferried from beach to beach by fishermen, and with the cover of night running along the beach and things like this, hiding in huts for a whole day and having to be quiet, and then finally being kind of hiking into the woods to stay with these people who, I mean, it looks like the jungle because it all, in the film, we're always hiding in the trees, but really it's all cultivated land. You know, it's these are coconut plantations, and between the coconut plantations there are still ravines and woods where the guerrillas hide. So it's an agrarian revolution. It's Maoist, like in Vietnam or China, and it felt like I had been transported to a different age because of, you know, there's this obvious nostalgia of when we think about Marxism and revolution, it seems like something very 20th century. But also, it's an agrarian revolution because it's a, you know, in Maoist terms, it's a semi-feudal society. Really, these people, not the guerrillas, but the people they're talking to are peasants. Peasants, like in medieval England, they live on land they don't own, and they pay everything that they make to the landlords. So I went out there with this intent of making a conceptual work about theoretical Marxism, and, you know, the idea of the film was this, you know, structural affinity among Marxism, conceptual art, and documentary, where there's a relationship between theory and practice. You know, like it is materialism. You know, you start from a theory and you make it real in the world. And I kind of wanted to explore that formally in the structure of the film, and also, you know, in the very real content of, you know, people struggling to make this theory real. So, and this,
you often say that you sort of do that. That's your process of work. You might read something or get an idea, and then think, right, there's a film, and then you then go through the process of research and you know. And was getting there, did you think that was going to be the difficult part, or was it just that you got so far down the line that when you found your subject, suddenly you're out in the jungle for 8 weeks and you think, because I asked you whether you thought it was a kind of brave thing to do, because you're trained as a documentary filmmaker, you know, that's what documentary filmmakers do, they go to war zones or they go to places like this, but did you suddenly think, oh, what the hell am I doing here?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that as well, because as an artist, I don't have the superstructure that many documentary film. I can't get on the phone to, you know, BBC and say, you know, I'm in trouble and I'm not insured to the hilt, you know, and I don't have a camera crew. I'm you know, there by myself, or I don't have access to fixers, and also, you know, be that as it may with documentary photographers and journalists. And they don't often go, you know, are not embedded with terrorist groups or, you know, something that is so illegal. And I had to be very careful in that way. You know, I couldn't give them anything. For example,
they wanted to give you a gun, didn't they?
They wanted to give me a gun when I first got there. You know, I mean, one of the ways I introduced myself to them was by telling them telling them that I am a Marxist, as, you know, many people will say, you know, who are either academics or labor activists or just politically. We all say it, you know, theoretically in this context, but when you're there, it means that it's something very different. You know, it's something you can be thrown in jail for. So they right off called me comrade, as they do everybody, or friend. You know, it's the same word in Filipino, and they tried to give me a gun, and it was that strange kind of Stockholm syndrome, kind of, you know, am I one of them? And I mean, there's always that tension in my work about how much I'm participating in what I'm viewing. I made, as you said, films about Christianity. Sometimes quite ecstatic or miraculous Christianity, and I introduced myself to them as a Christian, and I grew up Catholic. I was an altar, so I can say that with some kind of credentials. But at the same time, you know, I'm really not a good Christian in any sense of that word. And so, but while I'm filming it, necessarily, I have to give myself over to them and their beliefs. Because a lot of the work is, I like to think it's about subjectivity as well, and the interplay between, you know, the subjective positions of the audience and the people on screen and me. So I have to kind of stand in between all those things.
Yeah, and I suppose they seem quite accepting of you in this film. I mean, we might have time for another clip later of another film in which you didn't seem to be welcome, but they seem to welcome you. I mean, I don't know whether that was because they were just kind of, you know, did they have any suspicions or about what you were doing, or did you ever feel like it was too awkward, or?
Not at all, actually, never. You know, I think they thought that if I came all this way with such good intention, then I must be okay. Maybe they might have been suspicious because I'm American, and you know, a lot of this film has to do with being American. And maybe not obvious from the text, but for me the subtext is really, you know, it's a film about U.S. imperialism. You know, what is the real? If I wanted to make a film about, or artwork about the other, you know, what is the other in terms of Americanness? And it's, number one, a terrorist organization, Marxist communist, but also the Philippines was an American colony. It was, I mean, really part of the empire, and you know, is no longer part of the American political structure, but it is certainly a neo-colony, and American imperialism is everywhere. And
they talk about some of the land being owned by Americans as well. Yeah.
And I mean, certainly many of the Filipino bourgeoisie live in America or have deep connections. Yeah. But also, visually, it looks very much like Vietnam, and historically has that relationship as well. It looks like Vietnam because the Philippines was used many times for Vietnam War movies, like in Apocalypse Now. It was shot in the Philippines. So there's that whole subtext, but never were they suspicious of me. I think partially because, you know, I came in with the blessing of the Communist Party, and so I wasn't kind of wasn't knocking on guerrillas' doors saying, "Please, can I film you?" I was kind of delivered to them as being, you know, one of them. And I
mean, it shows because they open up to you as well. They're very confessional. There's some really emotional bits in there. You know, there's a bit where one of the sort of elder statesmen of the group is sort of planning out an attack with some stones on a bit of kind of scrubby ground, and he's surrounded by these kind of kids, these boy soldiers. You know, I don't know how old they were, but you know, really young, and they do open up to you kind of on the tape.
They're at least 18 years old, as accordance with the Geneva Convention, I should say. That's why I was there for so long. I mean, I didn't start filming until I felt like I had a relationship to them. And I think, you know, that's one, it's, you know, not, it sounds like manipulation, but it's really, I mean, it's part of the process of for me, it's part of, it's a technique, it's a emotion, you know, it's a relational aesthetic, as it were, but I mean, there has to be a basis for friendship, and you know, many of them spoke English, most of them did not, but even without English, we spent so much time together from morning till night, and I trusted them. You know, they trusted me with their image, and I trusted them with my protection, and also, I mean, without sounding like too much of a communist, it's amazing atmosphere to be in a squadron of people who are calling themselves comrade and calling each other comrade, and the ethic is really one of a family. They share absolutely everything materially, and there are no secrets between them, and that's one of the rules. And so it wasn't only their relation to me, but that's actually who they are and what they believe in. And I think it's also, you know, to be fair, Filipino culture is extremely polite, and for me, I think, you know, everybody I met in the Philippines was so sweet that it's very lucky for a film like this.
It's interesting you talk about manipulation and not wanting to appear that way, but then documentary making is a lot about manipulation, or a lot about trying to corral the facts into one way, or one theme, or one narrative. But you don't seem to do that. I suppose if you do at all, it's later on when you have 3 screens or you have something different going on. The actual kind of storytelling, you don't use a voiceover, anything like that. There's no kind of guiding voice.
I mean, it's not obvious. I think but I do, the way I shape the film from the camera work to the editing is always, you know, I do have an intent and a message.
Very specific. Yeah.
And I think these kind of techniques are subtle, because it's so observational, and that you know, it seems, even though when it seems like it's fly on the wall, it's actually very directed. You know, like I'm directing reality. I'm telling people, don't put words in their mouth, and I don't necessarily tell them what to do, but I get what I want, and that's the manipulation.
Yeah.
Like, and for example, you know, there's a scene where she gives a lesson in Marxist-Leninist theory to the peasants, and I didn't fully suggest it, but you know, she knew that I was interested in seeing something like that. You know, I said, oh, I heard that you kind of, it's also about teaching, and you know, because the work units I was with were not, they were not military units in that they weren't attacking. They were militarized in that they had, you know, guns in case they were attacked, and eventually they were, and they all died. But they were mass work units, kind of getting the peasants to throw off their chains, as it were. And you know, even when they had other tasks to do, they knew what I wanted to see, and so provided that for me. So it wasn't, not everything was natural. It was like, you know, there is a bit of theater that I set up as well. So I'm kind of directing people in their authenticity.
That sounds dodgy. Yeah, I know what you mean. But you talk, I mean, does the New People's Army still exist, though, even though there's this particular group was it pretty much wiped out? How do they sort of wait for the military to come and, you know, the army to come and clear them away, or how does their sort of conflict work? Well,
I mean, the Philippines is an archipelago of many, many islands, and when you're there, most people have no method of getting across from one island to the other. So it's a very strange place because most people are poor, and so they can't fly, and so it's this. It feels like the world. You know, to go from one island to the other by slow boat is expensive for anyone.
Yeah.
And so there's a slowness there of like. At the same time, you know, all the squad leaders have mobile phones, so there's like this rapidity of communication and slowness of movement. But yeah, the New People's Army is still going strong, and you know, at one time they're fighting a slow war that has flashpoints and is hot. They're still in peace negotiations, as they have been for decades. This unit, my friends, were attacked last year, and it's impossible to know who exactly died. You know, some of the names came back. Many of the names were unrecognizable because they all used noms de guerre, you know, pseudonyms to protect their families. Many of the bodies were unrecognizable because the military mutilated them.
But you were sent a kind of.
I was sent a roster, you know,
a roster from the Communist Party, right?
From the articles from the Communist Party newspaper describing who had died, and certain people were obvious to me. And actually, I was, you know, Communist Party affiliates in Europe asked me about the others because I was one of the only people to know who they were, so I could identify them and, you know, also put them together with some of the images. But I know I can say with confidence at least half of them are dead. And they basically they do anticipate attacks and prepare for them, and sometimes they do attack the military installations, more likely a police installation, or more likely, even more likely, the landlords have kind of gangs of thugs to enforce their feudal law on the peasants, and they protect the peasants from those gangs. And there's a scene in the work that you see that kind of enforcement, and that's kind of like Robin Hood. I mean, if you see the work, there's this. I mean, I was thinking Robin Hood when I made the work because of this kind of almost medieval quality, but they basically stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. Aside from all this Marxist theory and this Maoist history, I mean, it's very basic, you know. And so, with that, there's a real fairy tale aspect to it as well.
Yeah. I think so, yeah. And I think the kind of one of the overriding concerns, not just in this piece, but in a lot of your work, is the idea of belief. And it was interesting you were talking about it being kind of, I didn't see it from an American perspective, but I always look at your work and think, well, they believe in that, whether it's, you know, some higher religious or, you know, political calling. And I tend to then reflect that back on myself to think, well, what is it that I believe in? And you sort of think, well, you know, they're obviously, you know, they're kind of off on some completely different tangent, and you might think, you know, thank God I'm not in a war zone or whatever, but actually it also questions your own beliefs. You know, what is it that I actually strongly do believe in, being vaguely apolitical, vaguely agnostic, you know. I don't know whether you want the viewers to react in some kind of way, or whether it's just that the subject matter is interesting enough in itself, but I always get that kind of sense of, well, what is it that I should be believing in, having seen this? Anyway, that's my personal thing.
That's exactly what I intend. I think there are two things about that. First is kind of speaking formally about documentary. What I was never interested in journalistic reportage documentary, and wanted to make something that was less empirical and more phenomenological. And so if the content, you know, how do you get an image that isn't about evidence, you know, or facticity? This isn't a fact. This isn't what simply is. It's not only an actuality. And so I had been in my earliest works like looking at situations where people held subjective truths that were often contrary to fact. You know, so religious ecstasy, political militancy, people trying to force their beliefs into the world, or believing in something so strongly or so transcendently that it becomes real. And that kind of plays between mythology and history, or kind of a more complicated idea of truth than simply actual facticity. So that's one thing. And then secondly, kind of our vague and average everydayness, to challenge that, and our vague and average everydayness in this kind of, especially in the New World Order, in this kind of after, and this was directly what this film was about, after the Soviet Union had fallen, and George Bush was talking about the New World Order, and Francis Fukuyama talking about the end of history. You know, that suddenly seemed like the neoliberal capitalism and was the order of the day, and that was every developing country was making a teleological progression towards that, and it was this kind of undeniable imminence of capitalism and kind of capitalist parliamentary pseudo-democracy as being this kind of ideology. And I thought there must remain an opposition to that idea, you know, out of idealism at least, you know, because we're all well versed in how that's, you know, falls short of anything resembling democracy, but also how it's brutal. And so I felt like there's what's kind of most insidious about that, also existentially, besides politically in terms of human rights and all of that, is that we're kind of left with this feeling of, okay, well, reality's good enough, and now, but we don't fully believe in what we're participating in. And so I kind of, this postmodern kind of agnosticism, not only towards God, but towards all political or philosophical belief, I thought was really piss poor. And I saw that a lot in kind of art as well, as being, you know, so much of art was structured as a question and nothing very declarative. And, you know, the aesthetic had been one of playfulness rather than one of strength.
No, and in fact now what that's making me think is that my own belief system is that by default we're all part of this kind of capitalist, you know, higher being, as it were, or higher belief system. But all your work somehow do sort of reflect on those being a sort of systemic failure, that then there is something within that isn't working as well. It's not explicit. Well, it might be a bit more explicit if we watch the next clip, but you say that you're not interested in journalistic intent, and yet, you know, you do. I don't know how you exactly sort of chanced upon this group, but you said that, you know, to me that you were a bit of a news junkie and you watched BBC News or Rolling News, and you know, and you're reading. So it's almost like the works come out of something that you find or see on TV, just like anyone else. How does that then turn into something more, something you want to actually go and...
Well, I suppose you know, it depends on how, when the work starts from a situation that I'm made aware of, and you know, on BBC, I first read about this group on the BBC website because they had performed the first gay wedding in the Philippines, and a general married a foot soldier, and they said, all love is revolutionary, especially gay love. We pledge our lives to each other and to the revolution. I thought, this is fucking brilliant. Like, you know, who has ever said this better? And you know, and I had been kind of reading Marxism through Slavoj Žižek and Alain Badiou, and had this, immediate kind of affinity for them because they were a Marxist group, and also because the works I had been reading were talking about, you know, not picking up the pieces of Marxism, but what is persisting after the end of the communist state, you know, after the so-called death of communism and what Badiou calls the obscure disaster of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the corruption of China, like what persists of this. And as an artist, I was, you know, not, my interest in Marxism is, okay, theoretical and political, but also very aesthetic. Like the works of Rodchenko, for example, or the poetry of Mayakovsky, and film from Eisenstein and Vertov, but also through in the 60s and 70s, Godard and Pasolini. You know, that was always the work that inspired me, and I didn't want to let go of it. And you know, so the fact that they persisted seemed to kind of mirror what these philosophers were saying theoretically.
And is that why, for example, you didn't, from you know, being trained as a filmmaker, you didn't go straight into documentary or journalistic filmmaking, because those were your influences rather than, I mean, you know, you say that you're a bit of a news junkie, as kind of we all are now, but also, didn't you start making your first film on September the 11th, for example? Yeah. So, you know, there is a reactive thing there.
Well, I was always kind of, I mean, some of these issues about what's documentary and what's fiction and what's art and what's cinema or journalism, my friend, you know, when I was having a kind of anxious moment of that, about that, my friend Mark Sladen said, you know, Mark, these are curatorial issues. You just make what you want to make. And I thought, great, you know, that's all and that's my answer from now on. But I think, you know, from the earliest, I have always been kind of going after that distinction, like within my work, trying to, because what's most interesting is work that presses against that very anxiety. So I started making my first work on the day of September 11th. I was working in New York, and I was working together with two documentary film collectives. One's called Third World Newsreel, and the other is Paper Tiger Television. And they're two groups that have stake both in film history and art history, because they're video activist collectives from the 70s in New York. And if you kind of read about that in American art history, those are the places they pop up. And they long have participated as much in the art world as anywhere else, but also distribute their work and show them to activist groups and student groups and things like that. And I had been working with them already before September 11th, and on the day of September 11th, I was in Lower Manhattan, and you know, emerged from my subway to work, and it was 9:15, and I looked up and saw what had happened, and I went and I got a pinhole Kodak camera, because my phone didn't have one. It was 2001. And I just started taking pictures, and those pictures unfolded to be my first short film. And that I made as a portrait of a man who had, you know, was perhaps a terrorist affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and in any case had fought in Afghanistan and was trained in the Osama bin Laden training camps, which after the Afghan war did become Al-Qaeda. So he had that kind of mujahideen history, and it was a portrait of him and his life in New York and his thoughts on the situation. So that was, the idea of that work was to deliver the film and the audience entirely over to his perspective, which was totally anti-American and murderous. And of course, you know, the only people that would want to show or see it are an art audience, you know. And I showed it at MoMA. And then, you know, from there, I came here to the National Film School and made my first student film about Abu Hamza, and showed it here in the ICA Beck's Futures. Yeah. And then I think the problem I had faced was because there is this kind of clarity about documentary, and people are so used to reading it as journalism or nonfiction cinema, they don't look for like the more subtle formal cues or structures.
Well, let's skip forward a bit, because talking to Mark about those subjects, I felt like you'd got there before all those debates started becoming kind of retrodden over about documentary and art. So we play the next clip, which is from 2008. All That Is Solid Melts Into Air, and that will we can start talking a bit more about the formal aspects of where you decided to take film from just being a single shot to the multiple screens.
Yeah, again, that's an installation view from the Berlin Biennial.
since I dey throw net. Now so I go take feed my pikin. But yesterday na Saturday, today Sunday, I dey throw net every day. But today no fish. I no dey fit train my children again. So I don't drop this net. Now I tell lie to me this problem. I don't drop am. I will carry knife. When I carry this knife, I go hold Igbo man. As if they snap me, I go hold her. So that government will give me 10 million. Look, I take my children to chop. This is my way to snap myself. I don't mind to tear my body. I go take this knife, they tear my body. That's why I go grab. I don't vex. I don't vex. So make government remember us. If they don't remember us, I give government for 30 days. If they don't remember us, I will hold Igbo people so that they go remember us for this bush where we did. For this bush where we did. Now here they come drill our oil. I go show on our oil well. Government they take am. Me I dey suffer. 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 That kind of day, when man pikin God create me, go because of my wealth. He caught me like, you know the enter. 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 But me, I caught, he go enter you. So make I remember also, I will take this knife, collect gun, and enter bush. Now monkey I go shoot, but I go shoot big monkey. Thank you, Papa, thank you. Next time, don't come here again. Today, their last day. Don't come here again. Don't come here again. My Papa teach me how to hunt. Thank you. Don't come again. I'm not there. I'm out of here.
You want to show the next one?
No, just at the end.
So yeah, just explain a bit. So it's interesting having seen the installation shot at the beginning because I had not seen that one installed. I'd always assumed there was a left and a right, but there's one behind and one in front.
Yes.
So the one on the left we'd have seen, that was the Chicago.
That was the
Stock
Chicago
Exchange.
Mercantile Exchange, yes.
Just before or during the Bear Stearns banking crisis.
Exactly.
On the left-hand side, and that gets much more hectic, the left screen, as the film kind of develops.
Yeah, that was the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. I was filming in the futures and derivatives trading pit, coincidentally on the day, the week that Bear Stearns collapsed, and that was the first American investment bank to collapse. And although the financial crisis is usually kind of dated later, like in September, October, when other banks followed, really, I would mark that as the beginning of the financial crisis. And the idea of the work was about dematerialization of, first of all, art, but also of petroleum. And on the one hand, you have the futures and derivatives trading pit. They're trading oil, but not only oil as a commodity, but oil as a future or the derivatives of it, so like financial abstractions of oil. And on the other screen simply is the real economy rather than the abstract economy, and the real economy where they're taking oil from under the feet of poor Africans. And this was also part, so that's a clear Marxist dialectic, and also a critique of the materialism of my work as well. I had been talking to sculptors and painters who are interested in formal, the actual material of what they're working with. And it's often said that video is one of the dematerialized art forms, and actually it's not. It's made of electricity and plastic, and those things come from petroleum. And so there's a little bit of institutional critique towards me as well. And I made this with funding from Film London's Artist Moving Image Network and also from the Rijksacademy, I did a residency in Amsterdam, and it was a bit of institutional critique as well of kind of state public funding and our relationship to the Dutch-English company Shell. You know, the Shell is the antagonist in this film, Royal Dutch Shell. You know, they're the ones who are killing everything there.
So what was that the first kind of split screen work that you did? So what was the decision there? Because again, I thought, having seen the clip, that there was one on the left and one on the right, but that you constantly have to flick back and forward, so you'd actually have to turn yourself in the space to see the two different screens.
Also, I mean, to see them fully, yes, but part of the decision was actually about the space in between them and this kind of very sculptural aspect that it has when it's fully installed, and the screens are life-size, so there's this hyper-realist aspect when you're looking at either one, but being split between these very loud and colorful images, it activates the space in a strange way. I mean,
And they do go together. They're not fighting with each other. They're sort of choreographed in a way that, you know, you can move from one to the other.
Yes, and they're in dialogue, but also formally. For example, in the first shot, you have the numbers going by on the screen indicating, and in the same direction, you know, the oil installation is moving past. So when you're standing in between them, there's a real feeling of swirling. You know, it's a spiral, as it were, and also the colors, out of a happy coincidence, and also out of editing. In the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, they wear different colored jackets, red, yellow, green, and blue, to indicate their different functions in trading. And the militants, who didn't make an appearance yet in this clip, but they have amazing traditional tribal costumes that are bright primary colors as well. So it's for me, many of the decisions are, you know, quite aesthetic. I mean, I just think it's beautiful, and it gives this kind of feeling of anxiety, of fragmentation, really. So
and sonically, the whole thing builds up. So you have sort of one soundtrack kind of will correspond with the other or take over. You know, they kind of do clash a bit. Then you'll have the Nigerian guys kind of yelling on one side, and then the traders yelling on the other side, and it all kind of builds up to kind of a crescendo. And there's a way in which, you know, the audience or the subject is fragmented between these two screens or situations, but there's also, they're attacking each other. They're in dialogue. When I was writing the synopsis before I even went to either situation, it was like, oh, two screens in dialogue with each other. No, they're like at war, you know? And it's this real confrontation of two images, and you're kind of split between them. As we all are, you know, existentially and politically, you know, it's impossible not to have sympathy for these, you know, starving Africans who are, first of all, quite eloquent and otherwise sympathetic, whose oil we are basically stealing. I mean, our electricity comes from oil from Nigeria. It's just undeniable. I think it's maybe 18% in England or something like that. And then on the other hand, these traders, these city traders, you probably all know financial workers who are very much like them. I have people like that in my family, who you have, you know, affinity with out of citizenship or proximity or, you know, familial affinity with. And so there is this kind of split of both formalism, where, you know, your attention is divided, but also affection as well, or affectation. And that also goes for the other work, for No Permanent Address, because actually, although you're kind of enveloped by these three screens, they're all doing slightly different things. So even when you only had one camera, obviously, but then there are slight time shifts. So sometimes you're not quite sure, you know, whether what you're watching is supposed to be, you know, in sync, or they're not quite in sync, and whether that sort of shows that you've got, you know, some different framing of what we're seeing, or what we're seeing is not quite the reality that we think it should be.
Exactly. Well, for me, every project I embark on will be an attempt to resolve contradictions in the previous work. Dialectics 101. And whatever problems I had with all the solid melts into air, I kind of was addressing in No Permanent Address. And the accomplishment of, you know, having these two films opposite each other working together, you know, I thought, well, why does it need to be, first of all, such an antagonistic contradiction? Isn't there a way to build a formal rhythm about the contradictions in one situation? And, you know, I wanted to first have a convergence of like a more formal convergence, this kind of very, I mean, anxious split between looking right and left. I wanted it to feel, at the one hand, more total, and at the same time reflecting a fragmentation of that totality. So for me, when I'm creating the work, it's also this operation of memory. And, you know, when I'm finishing and I'm standing there, I really, it's a deja vu, because these people are as big as I remember them. The situation is kind of laid out as I remember it, and I feel like I'm fully present. And the idea is a hyperrealism that approaches surrealism. But with this fragmentation in time, it also shows that, for me, it's how I experience my own memory, which is more dreamlike, but also it more approximates our everyday observation, which is fragmented, and this constant kind of jumping between the present, the anticipation of the future, our immediate memory of what has just occurred, kind of piecing together our observations of what we're looking at, and kind of presenting them all at once, and kind of, you know, it's the work of the imagination, Kant says, in the first critique. And so it's, what I wanted to do is kind of visualize that as, and show how, you know, we're editing our own visual sense at the same time, and kind of presenting it across screens. And also what I'm doing is, you know, in the clip I showed you at first, there's a very aesthetic fragmentation. So it's about, you know, the formal concern is one about rhythm, and I'm looking for something that I think is pretty, you know, as well as, you know, yeah, I don't want to make it sound stupid, but it's possible to over-theorize it. I'm like, you know, I'm an artist. You know, there's an aesthetic decision that is not theoretical. And then with the second aspect, I'm kind of constructing a scene in a theatrical way, or even a cinematic way. And there, you know, Eisenstein had described ways of kind of putting shots next to each other in order to give a sense of space. And I'm kind of doing that at once, and so kind of showing the fiction of editing, because, you know, there's only one camera. So if I kind of say I'm going to have, you know, show this aspect of the scene, this aspect of the scene at once, kind of looks like what's actually happening at once, but it's not.